The year 1942 became an unforgettable one for Indonesia. Amidst the turmoil of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army launched a massive offensive across Southeast Asia. The Dutch East Indies, with its abundant natural resources, became Japan's primary target. The Japanese Empire needed Indonesia's natural resources to fuel its war machine, especially oil and rubber. In a short period, the Japanese military launched a swift assault that overwhelmed the unprepared Dutch defenses, which could not withstand such a rapid and intense attack. Across various islands, from Sumatra, Kalimantan, to Sulawesi, Japanese troops landed and immediately seized strategic areas with their blitzkrieg tactics. On the island of Java, which was the center of Dutch colonial administration, the atmosphere was tense. The local population and Dutch officials watched as Japan attacked Dutch forts and military bases. Japan launched airstrikes that destroyed many critical facilities in Batavia, Surabaya, and Bandung. Shortly after, the Dutch defense centers were left in ruins, leaving the Dutch in a state of despair. On March 8, 1942, a historic meeting took place in Kalajati, West Java. In a silent and tense airfield, the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, General H. Ter Porten, met with Japanese Commander Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura. In this meeting, the Dutch unconditionally surrendered to Japan. For the Dutch, this was a major defeat, ending more than 3 centuries of their rule over Indonesian soil. After the signing of the surrender documents, the Dutch East Indies officially came under Japanese control, marking a new era in the archipelago's history. On the other hand, the Indonesian people initially welcomed Japan with hope. For over 3 centuries, they had lived under Dutch colonial rule, which exploited natural resources and oppressed the native population. When Japan arrived, they brought propaganda promising freedom and independence for Asia. The people saw Japan as an older brother, coming to free them from the grip of Western colonialism. In many places, people welcomed Japanese troops with open arms, believing Japan would bring positive change. However, this hope gradually faded. Japan treated Indonesia not as a sibling but as a new colony to be exploited. They implemented policies far harsher and more repressive than those of the Dutch. Japan introduced a forced labor system known as Romusha, where hundreds of thousands of people were forced to work on Japanese military projects, often under deplorable conditions. People were forced to work in mines, plantations, and infrastructure projects without fair wages, and many received no pay at all. The working conditions for Romusha laboris were extremely poor. They were forced to work long hours with minimal food and water. Their bodies were exhausted, and many fell ill without adequate medical care. Disease and hunger became rampant among these forced laboris, and many died on the job. Families lost loved ones without the chance to say goodbye, bringing profound grief to the people, and the initial disappointment began turning into anger against Japan. Japan also enforced strict control over information and culture. They established propaganda institutions promoting Japanese culture and instilling respect for the Japanese Empire. The Japanese language was taught in schools, and anything Dutch or Western was gradually eliminated. Radio stations and newspapers were controlled by Japan, with every piece of news carefully filtered. The Indonesian people began to realize that Japan's arrival was not liberation but a new form of colonialism, one more oppressive and cruel. Amid this repression, a new awareness began to emerge among the Indonesian people. They realized that independence would not come from Japan or any other foreign power. A spirit of resistance began to grow in their hearts, even if quietly. They started whispering about true independence, about freedom that could only be achieved through their own struggle. Japan might have ended Dutch rule, but they also became a new enemy that had to be fought for the future of Indonesia. In 1943, Japan began to realize that they needed more than just military force to control the Indonesian people. They understood that the Indonesians could not be managed solely with weapons and violence. Therefore, Japan established various organizations aimed at instilling a sense of loyalty to the Japanese Empire. One of the most prominent was Keimin Bunka Shidoso, meaning the Central Cultural Institute. Keimin Bunka Shidoso was a cultural propaganda institution established in major cities. Here, Indonesians were taught Japanese culture, starting with the Japanese language, traditional Japanese arts like calligraphy, kabuki drama, and koto music. Indonesian youths were gathered and trained in work skills, with the hope that they would grow into a generation loyal to the Japanese Empire. Japan aimed to reshape the soul and minds of Indonesians to identify themselves as part of Asia for Asia. However, Keimin Bunka Shidoso was only one part of Japan's larger plan. Japan also established semi-military youth organizations like Seinenden and Kiboden. Seinenden, meaning Youth Corps, aimed to train young Indonesians with discipline and basic military training. Here, they were taught formation drills, basic tactics, and rigorous physical training. They were encouraged to become reserve forces for the Japanese army, while simultaneously being indoctrinated with loyalty to the empire. Kiboden, or Auxiliary Police Corps, was another organization founded by Japan. Kiboden functioned to assist the Japanese police in maintaining security and order. The young men who joined Kiboden underwent strict physical training, where they were prepared to act as law enforcers loyal to Japan. They were trained to monitor fellow Indonesians and report anyone suspected of resisting Japan. In this way, Japan sought to control every aspect of Indonesian life. Initially, some young people felt they were being provided with useful skills and education. Many from impoverished backgrounds without access to education saw it as a good opportunity. However, over time, they began to realize that Japan's purpose was not to help Indonesians but to prepare them as labor and reserve soldiers for Japan. Disappointment began to grow among the youth, who started to question if they were merely being exploited. In their efforts to control the people further, Japan also introduced a mandatory reporting system. Everyone had to report their daily activities to the Japanese government. This made life increasingly oppressive, as people felt monitored at every step. Japan wanted to ensure there were no signs of resistance, and if any were detected, they would act swiftly to crush it. Fear and disappointment began to overshadow the lives of Indonesians who felt restricted under Japanese rule. On the other hand, the influence of Keimin Bunker Shidoso and these youth organizations gradually planted the seeds of awareness among the youth. They began to understand that they were merely being used for Japan's benefit. Many realized they could not rely on Japan for true freedom. Although still hidden, they started discussing independence and freedom in secret meetings, instilling a sense of nationalism among themselves. With each passing day, the disappointment and feeling of oppression grew. The youths involved in Keimin Bunker Shidoso, Seinenden, and Kiboden began to feel a burning dissatisfaction. Despite the strict surveillance, they started forming small networks to support each other and organize resistance plans. A movement of resistance slowly began to grow under the shadow of Japan's tight control. Over time, these young people came to understand that freedom could only be achieved if they fought for it themselves. For them, Japan was just as ruthless an oppressor as the Dutch. They could no longer place hope in the older brother who had betrayed its promises. Amidst growing disappointment and pressure, the seeds of resistance began to sprout in their hearts. In 1944, the situation became increasingly tense. Japan implemented more repressive policies and the suffering of the people reached its peak. The forced labor system, known as Romusha, had led to hundreds of thousands of Indonesians, including farmers, youth, and even women, being coerced into working under horrific conditions. Amidst this oppression, secret resistance movements began to emerge under the shadow of Japanese colonial rule. Small groups started forming in various regions, filled with individuals determined to resist the cruelty of the Japanese. This underground resistance movement was led by nationalist figures who had long nurtured a sense of nationalism. Among them were Sultan Syariah, an intelligent and brave intellectual, Amir Sharifuddin, a dedicated thinker with strong connections, and Tan Malaka, a radical figure who embodied the fiery spirit of resistance. They devised strategies in secrecy, established strong networks, and disseminated messages of resistance through various means, including secret codes and writings that could only be understood by those involved. The youth and nationalist figures held meetings in concealed locations, from the back rooms of shops to homes in rural villages. They discussed the future of Indonesia, formulating plans to expel the colonizers and instill the spirit of nationalism. These messages were meticulously spread, crossing social and geographical boundaries, igniting the spirit of resistance among every layer of society. Under the vigilant gaze of the Japanese, who monitored every move, they persisted in their efforts, silently fighting for the freedom they envisioned. Japan maintained a tight network of spies, and any suspicious activities could lead to arrests and torture. However, these risks did not dampen their spirits. In the face of adversity, they learned to employ guerrilla tactics and develop more comprehensive plans. Each step was taken with careful consideration, and the youth began training to safeguard themselves from the threats posed by Japanese surveillance. They understood that this resistance demanded extraordinary courage but also a high degree of caution. In Jakarta, Sultan Syariah played a pivotal role in uniting various resistance groups. He propagated the ideas of independence and nationalism through meaningful writings. Syariah believed that the people must prepare for a future that was free and sovereign. He recognized that this struggle was not solely against Japan but also a preparation for an independent Indonesia. His insightful thoughts and extensive network made him one of the most respected leaders in the underground movement. Conversely, Amir Sharifuddin, with his robust political background, leveraged his influence to galvanize the spirit of resistance among the working class and the impoverished. He believed that the common people possessed immense potential that could serve as a foundational pillar in the fight for independence. Meanwhile, Tan Malaka, driven by his revolutionary zeal, continued to disseminate ideas of freedom and sovereignty through his impassioned writings. Together, these three figures operated quietly, yet their impact resonated throughout Indonesia. Night after night, secret meetings took place. The participants in this underground movement understood the significant risks they faced. Each gathering carried an awareness that they might not return safely. However, the consciousness of the noble ideals they fought for dispelled their fears. They recognized that these sacrifices would pave the way for freedom for future generations. In the stillness of the night, they shared whispered hopes about the imminent realization of independence. This underground movement flourished, evolving into an ever-growing flame within the hearts of the Indonesian people. The spirit of nationalism and the resolve to achieve freedom continued to spread. From the western to the eastern corners of the archipelago, the populace began to understand that they possessed the strength to resist. Despite being bound by the pressures of Japanese colonial rule, their hopes intensified. The burgeoning nationalism amid this oppression laid a solid foundation for Indonesia's struggle for independence. In 1945, World War II began to enter its final stages, and signs of Japan's defeat started to become evident. The massive bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Allies shocked the world and accelerated Japan's downfall. In Indonesia, this news spread quickly, bringing fresh hope to the freedom fighters. In various places, the people began to dare to hope that the time for independence was drawing near. The spirit of resistance that had grown over the years now blazed brighter. Indonesian youths involved in underground movements and youth organizations felt that the moment for independence had arrived. Several young leaders such as Cheryl Saleh, Sukarni, and Adam Malik devised a plan to urge Sukarno and Hatta to immediately proclaim Indonesia's independence. They did not want this golden opportunity to slip away. They knew that if they waited too long, Japan or other foreign powers might seize this chance. On August 16, 1945, this group of youths took bold action. They kidnapped Sukarno and Hatta to Rengas Dengklok, a remote area outside Jakarta, to protect them from Japanese influence. There, they sought to convince Sukarno and Hatta that this was the right time to proclaim independence. They fervently insisted that the proclamation must happen immediately, without waiting for approval from Japan or any other country. In Rengas Dengklok, the youths tried their utmost to convince Sukarno and Hatta. They spoke about the hopes and determination of the people, about the struggles that had long been fought, and about the freedom that was at their doorstep. Sukarno and Hatta understood that the situation was critical, yet they continued to think about a well-thought-out strategy. After long discussions and intense tension, Sukarno and Hatta finally agreed to proclaim independence the next day. On the morning of August 17, 1945, the atmosphere in Jakarta was tense. In a simple house at Jalan Pegangsaan Timur No. 56, Sukarno and Hatta stood before a small group of people, including the youths who had worked hard to reach this day. There, in an atmosphere filled with tension and hope, Sukarno began to read the text of the proclamation of independence that he and Hatta had agreed upon the night before. With a loud and authoritative voice, he declared Indonesia's independence. "We, the people of Indonesia, hereby declare the independence of Indonesia." Every word spoken by Sukarno resonated in the hearts of those present. The red and white flag flew in the yard, symbolizing the freedom that had finally been achieved after a long struggle. As those words were spoken, the hearts of the Indonesian people throughout the archipelago seemed to roar in unison. They knew that a new history had been born. Indonesia was now a free nation, standing on its own feet, free from the shackles of colonialism. News of the proclamation spread rapidly, from mouth to mouth, from village to village, from city to city. In various places, people gathered to celebrate the long-awaited independence. In the villages, people lit torches and waved their homemade red and white flags. In the cities, the people took to the streets, shouting for independence with joy. The entire archipelago was filled with an indescribable sense of emotion, pride, and happiness. That day, the Indonesian nation finally became a free nation. The fallen fighters, those who had sacrificed their lives for freedom, now found peace in the hearts of the people. This long and sacrificial struggle had finally borne fruit. An independent Indonesia was not a gift from another nation, but the result of hard work, sacrifice, and unwavering determination from all its people. With this proclamation, Indonesia was born as a sovereign nation. The Indonesian people could finally feel true freedom, a freedom fought for with blood, sweat, and tears. Indonesia's history as a free nation began that day, and from then on, the entire archipelago united in the grand aspiration to uphold the freedom they had achieved.